The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Good day out there. We're just going to give about 60 seconds, as usual, for people to come on in and find their seat, so to speak, at the webinar here. We'll be starting up in just about 60 seconds, so just about at 1:01 Eastern Time. We'll be right back with you. Hello, everyone. Good day and welcome to today's Best Practices webinar. We're going to be getting an update from the STARTS Task Force. That's an exciting thing to say, task force. We're going to be having, of course, a great presentation from them along with our usual panel discussion. My name is Andrew Hamilton. I'm the Senior Application Specialist with Transfinder Corporation. If you have any questions or concerns during this webinar presentation, we want you to take advantage of the fact that this is an interactive session. So please do use the chat section of the GoToWebinar control panel to communicate with us. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to see what questions you have, and we'd love to respond to your questions too. So going on with today here, by the way, I'm going to be keeping an eye on that questions panel as well, so you may see text responses from me as we continue on. With that being said, let's have a warm welcome from the Transfinder President and CEO, Tony Civitella, who's going to share with us a few words before we get on to our content. Take it away, Tony.
Hello, everybody. How's it going? It's June. It's feeling good, right? 12th. It's our 12th session here, our 12th best practices webinar. I can't believe it's already 12. Wow, it's a nice, cool dozen that we've been doing this, conducting these webinars in partnership with NAPT. So I'm really excited. Hey, I always say it. Well, today's going to be a really important one. It's going to be one of the best, most attended. Actually, this time it's even true. It's even more true because we have, I think, over 1,200 registered attendees. And as I see how many people we're about to hit 800 pretty soon. So it's amazing. Why is this such a big deal? Like Andy said, this is about talking about these task force, about how when we reopen and really how do when we start up, what does that mean? And we're featuring some great members that's going to actually help us and give us guidance how to reopen schools. And this is really part of the industry leaders are going to give us these advices. So I'm going to be taking a lot of notes. I'm sure you will. And I'm sure you'll have some questions too, like Andy said. So please send us the questions. We'll do our best to answer them. If not, we'll be sending some more things through emails and so forth. So we also want to do our best to answer your questions, especially during maybe during the panel discussions and all that. So it's important we do this. Reminder, these will all be recorded. So if you're like, I can write fast enough, but sometimes I can't write fast enough, it's okay. It's recorded. You could watch this over and over again as often as you want. You could always find these recorded webinars off the Transfinder.com website. So don't even worry about it. If it's like, I can, you can listen to it in a few days from now, and which is fun here. One last announcement. I think you guys have been hearing about the StopFinder communication. We've extended the offer. It's a free product. It's a free offer that we're giving all of our clients. And actually, it doesn't have to be a client of ours. It's a communication tool that we're making this available to the rest of this calendar year. It's December 31st. Great product for you to keep communicating with parents, and even some of our clients are using it to communicate with the staff. Fully free. Again, whether you're a client or not, just take advantage. If you want some more information, send us an email at freestopfinder@transfinder.com, and we'll get started with you. Again, Always give a big thanks to Mike Martin for everything you've been doing for the industry, and really been great to partner with you guys during this crisis. And it's always an awesome honor to hear from you guys as really the leaders in the industry. And honestly, we've learned so much, and we've pivoted so many times just based on what we've been hearing. So thank you for your advice and everything you guys have been doing. Again, thank you so much, Mike Martin. So
Thank you, Tony. Appreciate it.
like the shirt, by the way. It's a real nice, good color too.
Well, yeah. Great.
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you. Thank you, Tony, and all of your staff for your help. I really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for dialing in today. Happy Tuesday. Happy June. We are one day closer to the opening of school, whenever that might be. We are in Albany, New York, as we're relocated, and I think we're probably significantly behind other parts of the country, but we all hope and expect that at some point we're going to be getting back to school. So as an industry, we've talked among the three national associations, those being NAPT, the National Association of State Directors of Pupil Transportation Services, which is led by my friend Charlie Hood, and the National School Transportation Association, which is led by Curt Macysyn. Curt is their executive director, and the three of us talk and work regularly. We communicate at a pretty high level, and one of the things that became clear as we were talking about this was that as an industry, we needed to try to come up with some sort of uniform response to the pandemic and specifically to return to school. And as you know, we've done several webinars here over the course of the last 2 or 3 months that have given you a variety of snapshots about the way different people in different parts of the country are doing that, but we haven't really taken a nationwide approach yet, and hence the formation of what we call the School Transportation Aligned for Return to School, the STARTS Task Force. Andy, if you would please take me to the next slide. The STARTS Task Force was originally formed about 6 months ago. Andy, next slide, please. And it sort of developed as the result of our conversations about the fact that we started to see some diversion in the way different people were thinking and talking about the issues that we all face in return to school. People have a lot of questions about social distancing on a school bus. They want to talk about the use of personal protective equipment. They want to talk about a host of other issues related to maintenance and or cleaning. They want to talk about student management. There's a whole variety of issues that are out there. And what we started to see, we started to see a bunch of guidance coming from different people. We saw guidance from the Center for Disease Control. We start to see guidance coming from other health-related agencies, both at the federal and the state level. And it became clear to us that part of what we needed to do was to try to put some structure to all of this, because as all of you know, getting back to school without school buses is going to be a massive challenge. And when we started to see school superintendents, school boards, other school administrators discuss all of these issues, we started to get I would say maybe diverted from the real goal, and that is to put as many children in the seats as possible. And when you start to talk about making sure that you have social distancing and other kinds of schedule adjustments, those are transportation issues as much as they are anything else. So we conceived this task force, and the goal of the task force is to just ultimately come up with recommendations that all of you can use, regardless of your geographics, regardless of your demographics, regardless of the size of your school, regardless of which state you're in, that will give you some guidelines and some guidance from the transportation perspective that will help you make a smooth, hopefully successful return to school. So when we started to think about the scope of this project, we realized that we were going to need some help, frankly, and we reached out to talk to two people that you've seen before over the course of the last several weeks as we've been doing these webinars. Our friends Jim Regan, who is the Managing Director of Capital Works Consulting, and Tim Ammon, who is one of the co-owners of the Decision Support Group. Andy, if you would please, next slide. We began to put together an infrastructure And Jim and Tim will kind of talk to you about the infrastructure itself here shortly. We started to talk about the ways that we should address this problem, to sort of wrestling this thing to the ground, so to speak. And what we realized early on is that a lot of this is kind of like building a plane while it's in the air. It changes week to week. It takes some time to adapt and to react. And it also takes some time to be proactive and to figure out where to be proactive so that we can shape the conversation. We've been talking for 3 months now about the need to get transportation at the table at the front end of these conversations. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened as often as it should, as often as we wanted it to, and as a consequence, we're sort of fighting uphill a little bit in some situations. So what we started to do was say, okay, while we have 2 people who will be managing the actual work of the task force, the rest of us will begin to focus on communicating and collaborating with other partners. So we created, and if you would, next slide, please, we started to develop a structure that would enable us to come out with a master set of guidelines regarding facilities, vehicles, driver and student safety, management practices, especially as they relate to routing and scheduling, and communication, especially as they relate to advocacy and public relations on behalf of the industry. So what we started to do was create an infrastructure where we have a steering committee, which is consisting of representatives of each of the 3 organizations. And then we started to drill down from that, and we thought we needed an advisory panel. So we reached out to other organizations in the school transportation realm, as well as other organizations in the education hierarchy. Andy, next slide, please. And we created an infrastructure that will show you pretty quickly. But what I'd like to do for now, at least, is invite Jim Regan in to talk about kind of the thinking that went behind the infrastructure that we created. So Jim, would you be kind enough to join us for a minute and talk people through the way we envision things moving forward?
Greetings, everybody. As Mike was indicating, there's probably a short list of options for boards and superintendents in terms of how they want to set up their schedules for the new school year. The goalposts are anything from normal opening to 100% remote learning, and split schedules or some hybrid schedules in between. Guidelines is sort of at the top, but we actually want to get down to actual practices as well. So, there could be a guideline for social distancing, but we want to identify the practices for social distancing in all your functions. That's drivers, shop, office, and so the idea is that we will have a set of practices associated with each guideline. So we will develop those guidelines. We'll have a master set of practices as well, and they'll be sorted. So if someone says, hey, what are you doing about this guideline? You'll have a set of practices. You'll be able to sort those practices by function and say, what are you doing in your maintenance shop? We'll be able to sort those and say, these are the guidelines and practices that apply into maintenance. And then we realize that one size doesn't fit all. So we'll be sorting the data with the input of people who have volunteered to look at, okay, do these guidelines and practices apply to urban, suburban, small city or town or rural? So we end up with a subset. And then again, we might go back and we're going to run the same practices and guidelines to saying, hey, do these apply to a 3-tier, 2-tier, or a single-tier structure? So that's kind of, then finally, we're going to do a sped review of everything. And then we may come up with an enhanced set of practices that apply to the special education environment. So it starts with the scheduling. It goes into a set of guidelines. Then we add a layer of practices. And then we test the applicability by district type and district tier structure. That's it, Mike.
Great. Thank you, Jim. Andy, take us to the next slide, please. So that's what we decided to do. We thought, okay, that's a fairly complicated task. It's going to take us a while. So this is what we created as an infrastructure for the task force. As you can see, as I mentioned at the top, those of us who are on the steering committee, which are representatives of the three associations, NAPT, the State Directors Association, and NSTA. As you can see, the advisory committee is on the right-hand side, and in addition to inviting organizations like the Council of Chief State School Officers and the National School Boards Association, we also invited representatives of the three largest school bus manufacturers, because candidly, that's the equipment that we use. That's the base of everything that we do. As you can see, directly beneath that layer of infrastructure, we have Jim and Tim, who are the people who are managing this entire project. And then beneath that, we divided the issues, as I mentioned before, into health and safety, communications, advocacy, and public relations, and scheduling, routing, and school buses. And we left those topics purposefully broad because, again, we're building this plane in the air. We're not exactly sure where things are going to fit ultimately over time, and we didn't want to pigeonhole anyone or anything. So what we've done then is each of the associations has reached out and asked for volunteers among our membership, those people who are genuine leaders in the field, and said that we would like you to co-chair each of these committees. And we, as you can see, all of us were very, very fortunate. We had some tremendous talent step forward. All of the people who are the co-chairs of our committees are leaders in this industry, and particularly in their states. These are folks that we all look to regularly for advice, guidance, and information. And beyond all of that, they are just genuinely good people. They're collaborative, they're smart, they think on their feet well, and that's what we were looking for. So we are really pleased and proud to announce today that these folks are the co-chairs of the committees of the STARTS task force. The people that they will be working with, their natural resources, so to speak, are all of you who volunteered. We put out a call to each of our respective memberships several weeks ago and asked for volunteers. And I'm really pleased to say that we had over 115 volunteers, people who said, look, I've got some time, I'm not sure what I can do to help, but I would be glad to try to help you if I can. We've surveyed all of them. Andy, next slide, please. In the course of surveying them, we gave them a little bit more information about what we were looking for, what we were trying to do, and the number sort of whittled itself down. We ended up, I think, ultimately with something in the neighborhood of 85 to 90 people who have volunteered to do this. And I want to make sure to all of you who did volunteer and or haven't heard from us yet that we know who you are. We will be communicating with you. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that we're going to be able to have everyone involved in this process and or in this project. But we're going to have a grand total of probably something in the neighborhood of 40 or 50 people who will be collaborating and working expeditiously over the course of the next 4 weeks to try to accomplish a variety of things. As you can see, these are what the actual program requirements are. And what I'd like to do, Andy, if you would please, next slide. What I'd like to do now is ask Tim Ammon if Tim would click in and talk to us about the next step in the process.
Thanks, Mike. So for all of you who have heard about and been participating either through volunteering or paying attention to what's happening with the STARTS task force, one of the things that we have focused intently on is operationalizing questions and concerns about the guidelines that have been established or that have been proposed by CDC and various state agencies. And one of the ways that we are looking to do that is through this process of deliverables from each of the committees. So as Mike mentioned, we've got 3 core subcommittees that have been established. That's the health and safety, communications, advocacy, and public relations, and scheduling, routing, and school buses. And overlaying on top of those is the broader context for all of the elements of health, safety, and operations that you as transportation providers are going to be faced with come the start of school, which for some of you is literally weeks away. So I think what you'll see that we have tried to address is really a four-phase aspect of the project, where we are attempting to grab as much information and data from as many sources, both in industry and in associated industries, as possible, in order to be able to use that information to create what Jim mentioned, which is the opportunity for districts to be able to see guidelines that are being established and that are being asked for of transportation providers, and what some of the responses to those guidelines can be. Ultimately, what we want to be able to do is to be able to look both within each of the designated areas of specialty covered by the subcommittees, and overall, what the impact of, for example, things like physical distancing, social distancing are going to be in the transportation services realm, right? What the operational impact will be, what the financial impact will be, what the actual viability of being able to accomplish that is. And a particular area of focus for us, as Jim mentioned, is the consideration of special needs populations. That's just, from our perspective, not students just designated with IEPs or 504 or any of those kind of things. It also addresses specialized populations like homeless and foster care that may end up with some different requirements and some different expectations that are necessary as part of any reopening plan. But in addition to that, we've also tried to keep a focus on this idea that while people are intensely discussing the first day of school, most people are not talking about the 100th day of school. And we need to be focused on the full scope of the 180 days when we develop this, in terms of your ability to provide services throughout the whole year. So what will be the structure and implementation strategies around all of the guidelines that are going to be necessary to be sustainable over time? And how do we reach out to particular organizations to be able to communicate both the concerns of transportation providers and also the possibilities that transportation providers can introduce? So who are these target organizations that we need to be able to speak with? And then lastly, because transportation is notorious for its lexicon and jargon, one of the things that we need to be able to think about is having a common resource guide and references, so that when we're talking about tier structures, people know what we're talking about. When we're talking about the difference between routes, trips, and all of those aspects of things, people know what we're talking about. What we want to be able to provide the industry with is a lexicon and language around each of these things, so that when you're speaking with your partners and you're speaking with the people that you have to influence and or are influencing, everybody understands what it is we're talking about, because it's going to be critical in the long term, for us to be able to say the transportation industry is focused on continuing to be a provider of access to school for every kid that we can provide access to. The guidelines that are being presented to be able to support that access are going to be implemented as such, whatever those strategies end up being. So what you'll see here is more details specifically on the overall deliverables. So much of what the subcommittees will be working on and the volunteers within the committees will be working on are on the front end, helping with data collection and helping with the identification of source material. From there, we will look at authority matrices and authority expectations in terms of whether people implementing guidelines also have the authority to establish them, or do they roll downhill, so to speak, and we're responding to those requests. How do we make sure that they're both reasoned and appropriate for the provision of access to school for kids? And one of the biggest resources that, and Jim mentioned it in passing, but I think his leadership on this and the thoughts on this from the executive committee and from the committee leaders, this idea of having a guide where districts can recognize themselves in it. They can see that I'm a small rural district somewhere with that's district owned and operated. Here are some resources that are appropriate for me to be able to get my transportation operation up and running and sustain it over time. And by doing that, what we hope to be able to see and hope to be able to provide to all of you is an ability to measure and understand what the impact of the guidelines, or whether it's distancing guidelines, whether it's issues around number of students at stops or loading zones at school, what some of those impacts are, so we can be as far out in front of that conversation as we possibly can. And being far out in front of that conversation feels a little bit like a misnomer with a 5-week timeline on something that's this big, but as you can see, the process is underway. It really started in earnest late last week and is kicking along with first meetings of subcommittees and so forth starting this week. And you can see within each of those designated weeks that we are targeting an early July delivery of those of resources to the industry, with a focus on initial data collection in week 1, summary and some initial testing of those structures in week 2, the ability to do impact analyses, first by size of district and type of district, and then by structure of routes in week 3 and 4. And then lastly, the assessment of the impact to specialized populations and the delivery of a final report / set of resources to the industry in week 5. So the timeline is ambitious. Everybody who has been in this process has been incredibly committed to putting a shoulder into the work that's necessary to do this, which we're really appreciative of. We're also really appreciative of all of the feedback and information that we're getting from folks in the industry, and would encourage you, and we'll talk about in a little bit about how to continue with that process, whether you're on a committee or not, because your concerns and your issues that we really want to be able to address here when we do get to that early July delivery of the outputs of the task force. Thanks, Mike.
Great. Thank you, Tim. Andy, next slide, please.
So there we go.
And Jim, do me a favor, Tim, if you would say that, Jim, if you want to click back in for me, please. Hey, Jim, click back in, please. Tim, do me a favor, if you would, please. I think it's important for people to understand the research. As you mentioned, data collection. We're also doing some original research. Would you do me a favor, please, spend a couple minutes explaining to people what we're going to be doing in terms of survey work and outreach?
Okay, first one, through the NASDPTS organization, we're actually asking each state director to identify 4 districts, 1 urban, 1 suburban, 1 mid-sized town, and 1 rural district from each state. So that means we'll have a representative sample of 4 districts from each state across different sizes or locations. And we've developed a survey of district superintendents that's focused on how they're making their decision about scheduling options, what are they considering, what options is it between A and B, and if they've made their decision, how did they make it? Number 2 is we're going to actually survey the state directors themselves on the COVID impact on their state's rules and regulations, to see what changes they might be considering within each state, as well as the type of requests they're getting from districts in their state, so that we can be responsive to those in our final product. And then on the commercial side, we're going to be doing a survey of NSTA members, which are the bus contractors and vendors, to ascertain what they're doing with their readiness plans and practices. And so by combining the top line, which is the scheduling options, looking at the survey of state directors in terms of here's what they're hearing the needs are, looking at the preparation on the commercial side, plus there is another survey we'll be doing with NAPT members as well, and then once we have the master set of guidelines and practices, and then we're going to go back, and again, we've talked about this a couple of times already, but we'll be coming back to the people who have volunteered and other groups to say, okay, do you think that these practices are suitable in the different sizes of districts, locations, and tier structures? And so we can test the viability of these guidelines and practices, which since we know one size doesn't fit all. And again, at the end, we'll put it out, we'll have the SPED perspective, and we'll have experts go through the whole thing and come through with that special education kind of focus. And then what we have on the committee is we have a data collection structure in Google. Surveys will be done with Google Forms, and when they fill out, we'll have all the data. We'll be publishing the results of each survey as we get all the results, and there'll be a mini white paper on each piece of research that we do. Thanks, Mike.
Great. Thank you, Jim. Andy, next slide, please. Now, as Tim and Jim mentioned, this is an awful lot. I wanted to make sure that today you had a good feel for the depth that we're going to investigate these issues and to evaluate everything in this process. By the same token, we're sure that you have a lot of questions, and we have not only Jim and Tim, but we have the other representatives on the STARTS task force with us today, Charlie Hood and Curt Macysyn from NSTA, Charlie's with NASDPTS, and all of us would be glad to answer questions and provide some additional information in the discussion portion now, where I'm glad to welcome Rick DeRico from Transfinder to the conversation. Rick, do we have any questions from the audience, or is there anything in particular that you'd like to bring up at the start?
I would, but everybody, you guys want to show me your cameras, and we'll jump right in. And Curt, is Curt called in? Is Curt on the line? I just first of all want to thank the panelists. My name again, Rick DeRico. I'm the Director of Public Relations at Transfinder.
Can you hear me, Rick?
I just also want to highlight. What's that? I'm sorry?
That was Curt.
I just want to thank everybody for participating. And I just want to highlight, I don't know if everybody realizes, Curt's on? Great. I'll just keep moving, and we'll bring Curt on when we have a quick moment. Just how significant, I don't know if everybody really realizes how important and how significant it is that these major organizations are working together in collaboration. Mike and I talk frequently, more frequently than he probably wishes. And you talk about how you guys are all friends. And I think that you just don't get a sense that there's any turf wars here. It is really about how to serve the schools in our country at the highest level. And you guys are doing that. So I just want to thank you. And before I get started, I did have one question came in from Mary, who wants to know, can we still volunteer? So anybody want to take that? Is there still room for volunteers? Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah,
Mike?
yeah, Rick.
I think Mike's.
Okay.
Rick,
At this point, the answer to that question.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you, Mike. I'm sorry. Jim, can you hear me?
Charlie, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you, Rick. I think there was
Rick,
there's
you
an
can hear me.
established process.
Is there
I
still
would
room
say
for volunteers?
people want to volunteer. Rick,
Right.
my short answer
You seem
is
to be
yes.
having some technical difficulties. Am I the only one experiencing this, or is it? Yes. Okay. Very good. We do have some questions coming in. They want to know, well, let me ask one quick thing. I just saw a headline. U.S. News and World Report had a headline yesterday that said, report, no way to reopen safely without federal bailout. And I don't know if you saw that story. It quotes a report by the School Superintendents Association that estimates that in order to follow the CDC guidelines, school districts with an average of 3,700 students would spend about $2 million that they didn't budget for $490 per student. Number one, I wonder, does that sound right to you? And then number two, is there any chance of a bailout? Anybody want to take that on? And then we'll get into some questions here.
So,
Mike, Tim?
I don't know if anybody else is having the audio. So
We're having
yeah,
audio.
so I think I'm not going to decry the list. Sorry, I just try to kill the audio problem with taking the video off for a second here. But I'm not going to try to invalidate what their estimates are. They seem a little bit high in some respects, and they're missing some core things like, what if you do need additional assets to provide service? That's not included in there, but I think it's the goal of what they're trying to do, which is to introduce people to understanding the additional costs that might come into school opening, is a laudable goal. Whether there will be additional money for this or not is a thing that is decidedly above my pay grade. But I think recognizing that people who provide services are going to incur additional costs at a time where people are also talking about budget cuts gives some context for how difficult this mission is going to be in the fall.
Okay, very good. So just a basic question. What do you think the biggest challenge that the task force has right now? I mean, you outlined a very aggressive goal. What do you think the biggest challenges you will have? You have a 5-week window here to meet those the goals that you put in place.
Obviously, can you hear me, Rick?
Yes.
It's translating and getting down to the practice level. A transportation director or a location manager for a bus contractor, they would have a hard time working with guidelines. I think we need to be more specific, and we need to break down those guidelines and identify specific practices to either comply or conform with guidelines. That's where the heavy lifting is on the project.
Anybody else want to add to that? Go ahead, Mike.
And I think, Rick, I think one of the other challenges we face here is in many respects people view the transportation input as the tail wagging the dog. That is a traditional kind of an education hierarchical viewpoint. Typically in school transportation, someone tells us what it is they'd like us to do, and then we just go and do it. I think in a lot of cases that people are coming across right now, people are suggesting things that they think we can do, and the reality is we're not sure ourselves that we can do them. That's an enormous challenge for us. So as a consequence, the ball is rolling right now, and there are states and there are a lot of local school systems who are saying, okay, here's how we're going to do it. I think the biggest challenge for us, frankly, is to try to stay, if not ahead of that, at least even with that. Everyone in school transportation is planning based, right? We want to make sure that we can deliver service on time, on task, and effectively and efficiently. And if someone sets a school start date of, let's say, a traditional school start date of August 14th or August 15th, you can't wait until July the 3rd or the 4th to get recommendations from a task force. You're going to be moving forward. But if you do move forward right now, you're likely to have to change your plans at least once or twice, maybe even more times than that by the time you actually get to the start of school. So that to me, from a conceptual standpoint, has been a huge challenge from the start, is how do we try to make sure that people don't think that they can do this without us, because they can't.
Yeah, this is Charlie. I would agree, and I would say the biggest challenge to build on what Mike said and Jim is really going to be the gap. Is really going to be the gap between what can be done feasibly and within any semblance of economic reasonableness, and what perhaps the health and safety guidelines may say we should be doing ideally under the guidelines. So we're going to be the bad guys in some cases. We know that, and I liken it much to the example when a school or a charter school says they don't like us controlling their school opening times, and we say, well, that's fine. If you give us enough buses and money, we can do anything, and drivers, which are in short supply. But if we can't get a 2-hour window between the opening of our earliest schools and the opening of our latest schools each morning and afternoon, then we can't triple run our buses, and we can't do it dirt cheap. And so there are feasibility issues involved, and that's the analogy I would use is when school transportation is not given any option to have influence over school start times, it is inherently more difficult and more expensive.
Does the task force, one of the questions that came in, is the task force, number one, do they view the CDC, are they guidelines, or are you accepting those as kind of like the rule? And then the other follow-up question to that by Alyssa is, Alyssa, I guess, wants to know if you also have contacts within the CDC that would help to actually like provide even deeper suggestions on how to implement their guidelines. But how do you view the CDC's recommendations as a task force? Anyone? Tim?
Rick, I'm going to suggest we just literally had a conversation about this the last 2 days. I think this is Tim and Jim all over. This is right up your alley.
Yeah, and
All right, Tim, sorry, there's a delay. I know we're having technical difficulties. I'm sorry for those listening. Go ahead, Tim.
I find that the CDC guidelines are stated as I think that the CDC guidelines are specifically described as guidelines, but I think people are taking them as requirements. And I think a major element of what we need to do as both an industry and as a task force is reinforce that idea that it is a guideline and that their as applicable clause is something that we've really got to consider, and that the distancing requirements and the expectations are operationally infeasible as a requirement, but are possibly manageable as a guideline. And much of what we have to do is to focus on that, because I think if it represents, I think, the biggest challenge that we're thinking of, which is we've got 16,000 school districts with tens of thousands of operators out there, all of which have to come up with their own operational plans around this. And it is unfair, in my opinion, to put them in a position to have to guess all the time. And so much of what we hope to be able to try to do is to provide at least the opportunity to make better guesses, I guess, but also to be able to have the chance to succeed in a sustainable plan over the course of the year, rather than just the first day the door opens. And I think it's important, particularly for Curt, to be able to talk some about the perspective of his organization and some of the challenges that they've seen as it relates to this, because the contractor side has a different element in this to be able to think about.
All right, Curt, are you on?
Oh, Rick, can you hear me?
Real quickly, for the makeup of
Can you hear me, Rick?
the task force, somebody asked, Curt, are you on? Yes, go ahead. Yes. Yep. Go ahead.
What I would say is that one of the
I feel like I'm
reasons
talking to
that the task
NASA.
force was convened was, with with respect to the point that Tim made is a lot of these things we have to decide in terms of feasibility, given the constraints. The CDC guidelines are guidelines that are offered in a vacuum, without consideration for the student transportation system. And so we, from NSTA standpoint, have reached out to them to have a larger discussion. I think one area where we can point to right now, and a state that I think is taking a broader look at this, is Kentucky. And we've had some information coming from Kentucky that says they're going to look at pupil transportation with respect to social distancing on school buses, and apparently come up with a solution of their own. And I think that's kind of the nexus of the task force, is for us to consider these issues, consider the safety of the students and the bus drivers and the student aides on the buses, as well as the endeavor of transporting, 26 million children to and from school every day, and come up with what we think are going to be workable solutions. So that's when Mike set the groundwork for our discussion earlier. That's why we believe the task force report has to instill confidence in all stakeholders that we've contemplated these issues in a comprehensive way, and here are the solutions we're going to offer.
Great, thank you. One quick question on the makeup of the task force. Someone asked, Justo asked a question. Are there, in the various areas, you have nurses for health and safety, PR directors, other types of experts in each of those categories, or are you still building those out?
So I think when we received the volunteer
I'll take
list,
that one, Rick. Hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
So we reached out, first and foremost, we reached out when we started this to 9 different other national level organizations and invited them to be involved in the task force. And to the extent that, and they included National Association of School Nurses, they included school superintendents, chief state school officers. We tried to go pretty much right up and down the line. And to the extent that some of them have responded affirmatively, their people are already involved. And those who have said that they're interested, they want to know more, we've been having ongoing dialogue with them. The goal ultimately is to have those perspectives all represented in some way, shape, or form in the dialogue, and to be involved in the conversation. But at this point, the answer to that question is we don't have representation from all of those other market sectors at this point.
How do you deal with the differences? There's a story out recently about Texas Department of Pupil Safety put out a notice that state guidelines prohibit any kind of barrier separating the driver from the students. So my question to you is, how do you, and I don't know, different states probably have different rules, different guidelines. How do you navigate that? And also, I guess a follow-up to that would be, can you give me some examples maybe of some of those major distinctions from one state to another that you have to navigate? But that might be just one. Any thoughts on that?
I have I'll answer this in a broad way, Rick, and that's why one of the subcommittees on the task force is centered around advocacy, because there may be things that we come up with in terms of a solution that are not currently permissible in certain states. And so when you also ask how are we going to navigate that, we're actually used to a state scheme with respect to education. So this is nothing new to us from that standpoint. I think what is new is the urgency in which we need to get to the bottom line in terms of some of these answers. But that's one of the reasons why we thought that engaging with policymakers and the general public was going to be so important that we actually created a subcommittee around that.
Curt, as a follow-up, then, do you think there might come a point where there's some national, policies in place, or more? Maybe there already are some, but more so to kind of homogenize this?
Actually, I don't think that's a realistic expectation because of the way education is primarily funded. You're going to see, my thought is that you're going to see similar to what we have in a myriad of other issues, 50 states come up with 50 different guidelines or solutions to this. But I think one of the benefits of the task force is that's going to be one report, and we can cross our fingers that all 50 states will look at it, understand that it's been put together by transportation professionals, and kind of lean towards our expertise in as they consider their back to school plans.
And I would say, Rick, that the barriers question is a really good example of one of the strengths of the task force, which is the involvement of our OEM school bus manufacturers, not just at the advisory level at a fairly high level, but also on several of the committees. We anticipate that school bus manufacturing engineers will be involved, and they'll be able to answer things like, why is there a prohibition on putting a hard surface within the head impact zone under Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 222? And the basis for which Texas has issued its directive, if you want to call it that, is because there are federal prohibitions as regard to the manufacture and sale of new school buses, that a number of states, even if they're not technically or legally required to follow them when they do modifications to their own equipment, not for hire, not for money, they still adhere to them for safety and inspection reasons under their own state or local regulations. So that's the beauty of having OEM involvement and that technical input that we've already got coming into the committees.
Right. I want to make sure.
One last thing, if I could, just one of the things that we're trying to be really cognizant of here is the semi-permanence versus permanence in terms of changes suggested. There are things that are going to be necessary to respond to COVID and the way that school opening will happen. Some of those things we may not want to be permanently part of the way that we provide services. So it's an important consideration to say, what are the things that are a response item versus what are the things that are a structural or systemic item that we want to have lasting over time. And that's something that will, I think, repeatedly come up during the conversations of the task force, but will be an important element of sorting as we go through.
Yeah, those plexiglass guards that are now at the counters when you go to the store, those are probably not coming down anytime soon. So there are some things that are going to be probably part of the new norm, and then there are some things that are, like you just mentioned, a temporary new norm. Two kind of related questions. Alan asked, he says, at this time, many contractors have decided not to renew contracts as so many districts right now. They're wondering how that's going to affect school opening. And then Robert piggybacks on that and says, and this is a direct question, in your honest opinion, do you believe school is going to start in September? So first of all, thoughts on contractors not renewing their contracts. Have you seen that? What kind of impact will that have on reopening? And is school going to reopen in September? It's August, but anybody can take a stab at those.
Well, I'm going to jump in on the contractor end. That's a question without a whole lot of context to it. widespread. It runs the gamut. We've had folks who are engaging with their school districts, and they've come to conclusion. I think the one area that's a legitimate question is if a contractor has not been getting continuing payments through the pandemic. Yeah, it's a valid question of, what now is the incentive to open up in the fall if you haven't been allowed to maintain your system. So I think that's just simple economics there. So if districts, haven't been paying contractors, yeah, they're probably going to run into some jeopardy in terms of their existing contract, in terms of opening, up in the fall. We hope that's not the case, but it also is, a situation where from the onset of the pandemic, we, advised our members to just be in consultation with your district. Come try to find that, common ground and maintain that transportation system, for the benefit of the kids, and in a lot of cases, we've been utilized as Wi-Fi hotspots, delivering meals to school, delivering band equipment, a whole host of things. So there's been a lot of great stories that have come around about districts and their contractors really coming together through the pandemic. So I would say, with respect to that, there's no one size fits all, but I would say the vast majority of districts and contractors, have formulated a plan and are going to be able to move forward in the fall.
Very good. I wanted to go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, I think it's easier to answer the second question first. I think school's going to open in August, actually. I don't think we're going to have to wait till September. I think we're going to see some early districts, the folks who are always early, that are going to be opening in August. And the consequence of that is that they're going to need assets to get kids to school. And it's where it's that is the intersection, I think, of these two questions, in terms of the items that Curt pointed out about how it's crucial in the immediate term for sure, but it's always been crucial that districts and contractors develop a solid partnership to be able to respond to and weather events like this in the same way they would whether they were district employees or not. And to the extent that contracts get dropped, I think districts themselves are going to have to look for what kind of, like any of the other questions we're going to have to answer, how best to rebuild that partnership, and then how best to respond to the events that occur by assessing the guidelines and assessing the expectations, and then what are the resources that are going to be needed to do that.
Great, that's good. So there's a lot of people who are saying just how appreciative they are. I want to make sure I highlight. There's many people just saying thank you for the work you're doing, and how they look forward to your report. Bob asked, he said, great job by the committee. I'm really encouraged by your work and look forward to the results of the surveys. My question is in regard to a 5-day scheduling options in your guidelines matrix. Do you see a scenario where we would implement a phased approach, much like the governors are utilizing, to reopen states? So, for example, beginning the school year with a split schedule by day, maybe the first 2 to 4 weeks based on the data, migrate to a normal full 5-day schedule. So do you see anybody want to jump in on that in terms of go ahead, Mike.
Or Jim.
Okay. In the work that I've done so far with members of the committee and just people calling me and talking back, the governor's influence on the situation can't be understated. In Ohio, for example, which is dead center in the Midwest, they're in a phase 3 reopening. Even in their phase 4 reopening, social distancing guidelines would apply. And that means to businesses and schools and institutions. If Ohio went to a phase 5, that means no restrictions, which means the schools would have the option of opening up normally, which means they could run 5 days. Now, whether a district would elect to do that might depend on the nature of the virus in their particular county. I think if schools are going to comply with a governor's mandate about where that state is in terms of its reopening, I think the application of social distancing is going to be the key element. So if a state is at a phase where the governor is indicating that social distancing has to apply to schools, then you will see split schedules or creative scheduling on a part of school districts. And I just think that that's inevitable.
Very good. We're already out of time. I want to have a final takeaway before I close it out. I want everybody to know, though, for starters, that there are a lot of questions. These will go out to the task force members and our panel members here, and we will get back to you with those answers, and they will be posted on Transfinder.com. Curt, I'm going to go with you because I can't see you on screen. I do not want to forget you. You're very valuable. So, Curt, can you give us just some takeaways for those who are participating today, what you want them to take back to their office?
Sure. Thanks, Rick, and thanks to Tony, yourself, and Transfinder for putting together these webinars. I think they're extremely helpful. The one takeaway I would have is the old adage, trust the process. And this is put together. I know folks are clamoring for answers, and largely we are as well. But as we, Mike, Charlie, and myself have gone through this process, and then of course brought Jim and Tim into the fold, we understood how important this report is going to be to instill confidence in the student transportation system moving forward. And so I'm confident, as you can see with the groundwork we've already set, that the report is going to be well thought out and comprehensive, and hopefully it will provide that backdrop for further discussion. But with a process in place, we think that the report will have that credibility to inspire confidence with policymakers, the general public, et cetera, all those folks that need to inspire confidence. So that's my takeaway, is that, come sometime in July when we're doing this webinar, we're going to have a lot more answers to the questions that folks are posing right now.
Very good. Thank you so much, Curt. Jim, I'm going to turn to you next.
As I said in the challenge question, you really can't implement a guideline. So I think the work, the takeaway for me is the importance of building a set of practices that are actionable items that can be implemented. You can start with a guideline, but you have to say, okay, what are the practices that are needed to either to comply or to conform with that guideline. So my takeaway is the importance of getting down to the practice level so that people have tangible, actionable items to implement in their districts or in their contracts.
Very good. Thank you so much. Charlie, next up.
Well, my comment needs to be real brief and just say that what Curt said about having will important. I know people are, I personally have gotten very impatient, and I would love to see the specificity of the practices that Jim refers to, and we will. So I just want to thank everyone for their patience and their trust and their willingness to continue working to see this. We're 3 months into the pandemic, and we're within just a very few weeks, 4 to 5 weeks of maybe 4 weeks now of seeing the finish line. And it's not a solid finish line in that the task force, I'm sure, will continue to do work as conditions evolve, but certainly the lion's share of the specificity that we're all crying for is something that we hope to see, we will see in just a very short period of time. So thank you, everybody.
Great, thank you. Tim.
Yeah, and I think to build off of what Charlie and Jim said, I think in the absence of specific direction and certainty, we need to make best reasoned judgments that we can. And what we in the task force hope to be able to do is to provide as much information and as much direction as possible to support those reasoned judgments, and also to engage both internal and external stakeholders to let them know what both the consequences of particular decisions are and what the opportunities are to ensure that we as transportation professionals can continue to be fully participating in part of the access to school for kids. And that's going to, and ultimately that's what everybody's goal is to ensure that kids continue to have an opportunity to access education in a way that's safe, reliable, and cost effective.
That's great. Thank you. Mike, are you there?
Oh, he had to go.
Oh, he did. Okay. I want to mention that anybody who has any questions about volunteering or more details, I'm going to send them to Mike Martin, and he kind of is the conductor that will help make sure that this gets to the right person. So you can reach Mike at mike.martin@napt.org. Again, I want to thank all the panelists for your wisdom, what you've shared. I think there's a lot of things to glean from this. I want to thank Mike and NAPT for their leadership. In a very difficult time, how bringing everybody together to come up with solutions. One thing I do want to remind people is if you do have a story about how you have done things that could be used in a webinar, or it could be part of a best practices white paper, we are continuing to grab those, and we put them on our website, transfinder.com. But just send us your story at mystory@transfinder.com, and we are, we believe that collectively we're going to get through this by sharing our own what's working for us. So please send that to us. Want to lastly tell you to, again, next Tuesday have another best practices webinar. So that's June 16th at 1 p.m. Eastern time. And until then, hope you all have a great day. Again, thanks so much for our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay.